Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the next of our free webinars that we've been providing. Effective Effort Consulting has been providing on a monthly basis to bring information to you that we hope you find to be helpful. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the transition from high school to college, skills that students will need to be ready to make that transition and to succeed in college, differences between high school and college, and factors to consider when you are making that list of colleges and visiting colleges, and then ultimately deciding on what the best match in a college is for your child. Tonight, I, along with Lori Andrescavage, will be sharing this information with you. So a little bit about me. I am an executive function coach. I'm a parent coach with Effective Effort Consulting, and I also happen to be a parent of a neurodiverse child who has made the transition successfully so far from high school to college. He's now a college sophomore. And Coach Lori is a licensed social worker and a specialist in the area of helping students transition from one thing to the next, whether it is high school to college, high school to career, or otherwise. So we're excited to get started. We have a lot of information to share tonight, and in full disclosure, we forgot to press record for the live presentation, but we will do our best to answer all of the questions that were raised along the way, and we to mention the comments, some of the comments that were made in the chat. So we apologize for if we miss anything, but we're doing our best and happy to re-record this for you because it's important information to share out. So the goals for tonight, I kind of have covered. So the differences between high school and college, the skills that your student will need and can start to develop now, and the college search, what to consider in a college when you're making that list, and then what supports are available, or what to look for in terms of supports, both on college campuses themselves, but also what other supports are available that are available privately.
So what are the main differences between high school and college? So I will touch upon these items. We will go into greater detail in the upcoming slides. But one is the time spent in class. So in high school, you're a student, your child is used to spending about 30 hours in back-to-back classes Monday through Friday. That significantly decreases in college. Your child is taking 4 to 5 classes, let's say. That's about 12 to 15 hours of class time compared to the 30 that they're used to. So it significantly decreases. What increases is the work outside of class time. So assume for every hour of a college course your child is taking, they should be spending 2 to 3 hours on studying, reading, assignments, essays. So less time in class, more time doing work. And as a result, the importance of time management greatly goes up. Your child will be responsible for structuring everything else outside of classes during the week, which they're not used to doing. And they typically have the support of you and others in their life to help structure their time outside of school, and that won't be the case in college. And that also goes along with advocacy. Your child will not be there with you on campus for you to help be their advocate. They will need to be their own advocate, especially because something called FERPA is in place that we'll discuss later. But you as a parent will have less access to academic information and how they're doing. So it'll be really on the child to be speaking up on campus about what they need if they're struggling. And then lastly, the accommodations process is really different. There's a change in laws from high school to college. So we'll talk about what that means and how to go about getting accommodations.
So when we are looking at the amount of time that a child has every week when they are in class, when they're in college, let's assume that they're up for 15 hours a day, right? So that gives them 9 hours to sleep, plus or minus, 7 days a week. So they have 105 hours per week when they're awake. And let's just say, for example, they have 4 or 5 classes at 3 hours per class per week. which means they have a total of 15 hours of class per week. That leaves 90 hours of free time for them to fill. And we provided this example of a client that we coach, and they only have 3 classes, which is not unusual because sometimes when you're a student with ADHD or learning disability, one of the accommodations that can be made is to have a reduced course load. But also it's possible that if each of these classes were 4 credits, that would be a total of 12 credits, which would be enough to be considered a full caseload, a full-time student. So this provides a great example for how much free time or how little time a student is in class. So how do they manage all of that free time? And what's included in what needs to happen during that free time? So this college study grid is an example of one way to manage all of that free time. Google Calendar can be another way to manage planning and keeping track of everything that needs to be done during those free hours. This college study grid happens to be a tool that's provided by Elizabeth Hamblett, who is a guru of the transition from high school to college. And she actually wrote this book. I don't know if you can see it well enough, but there's a little bit of a glare. At any rate, we consider her to be the guru of the transition from high school to college. And a lot of the information that we're sharing tonight is from that book, but also from her website, which is ldadvisory.com. You can see it at the bottom. So she provided this tool. And really, what are the things that students have to be responsible for outside of going to class? Well, doing the assignments, right? Studying, whether it's reading, writing, homework assignments themselves, preparing for tests. And again, like all of those things that are on this list, going to office hours, making time for fun, right? Because you have to have fun. It can't be all work and no play. So whether that fun is clubs that they might be interested in, leadership opportunities that they have, exercise, sports that they might be involved in, hosting a radio show, all kinds of opportunities exist for how students can spend their free time with extracurriculars, or just going out with friends, like hanging out in the dorm room or hanging out in the commons area with friends. But it also includes regular appointments, whether it be with doctors, whether it be with a therapist, an academic advisor. Those are some examples, a tutor. And then there's time to eat. They have to go to the dining hall or make their own food, depending on their living situation. And then, of course, there's like the chores that no one wants to do, right? The laundry, cleaning their room, cleaning the bathrooms if they're responsible for that, and then their own personal hygiene. And then there's sleep, right? So those are all of the outside of class things, to name a few, right? So that 90 hours can quickly become filled. And so here's an example of a student who has decided to use her calendaring system to incorporate all of those outside of class things. So it's a lot different than the other student who only has class time listed on their calendar at the moment, right? So this student I actually have been working with for since January, and it took about 8 to 9 months before she started to become convinced that it was wise to include all of the things on her calendar in order to track her time and make sure everything gets done. So you can see in this example, it doesn't just have her classes. And to be fair, this is the calendar that she shares with me so that I see it. So it's only one color for me, but for her, she uses multiple colors for different things. And so you can see that she has her classes in there, but she also makes time for what she's going to be working on. Like she's going to be working on going through the AME lectures again. She's going to finish a public health reading. She's going to work out. She has different appointments in there. And then she has some extracurriculars out there as well. A chapter meeting here, a community building meeting, And then up at the top, things that go across multiple days are assignments. So it's one way that we help students to learn how to plan for assignments is to include not just the due date, but when are you going to start working on that assignment? So that's why it crosses multiple days. So that's an effective use of a calendar, right? You have a visual representation of how you're spending your time to create the life that you want. So it's one of the things that is important for a student to adopt.
Courtney, it was around this time in the presentation that two comments were made. Somebody mentioned the time management strategy or tool called Notion, which we haven't heard of. So
That's
something
right.
to explore. And then another question came up about what if your senior in high school or your child in high school isn't yet willing or at a place to be using Google Calendar? What would you suggest?
And that's a webinar in and of itself. I think we were mentioning at the time, right? But it's a fantastic question and one that we wrestle with all the time in trying to help our, coaching clients come to the realization and willingness to adopt the use of a calendar. And they're at varying stages, right? And I think what I shared is that really there's the only way for a student to use a calendar or do anything related to executive function skill development is to have that internal motivation. We can't force it upon them. They have to want to. So it's really about inviting them, is what you're using currently working, and helping them reflect on that. And if they say yes, then okay. What is it about that system that you find allows you to be successful? And just continuing to invite questions. Or are you open to using a different system? Or if they say, yeah, it's not really working, if they come to that realization, okay, well, would you be open to using one, trying something else? So it's really about getting their buy-in first and foremost, and their willingness to participate in the use of one. And sometimes if we can phrase it as, we want to try an experiment and see what might happen, sometimes that can be helpful. And then the other important piece is to be open when offering ideas about what calendar systems to use, that there isn't one magic calendar system for everyone, that everyone uses, right? A lot of people use Google Calendar. There are a lot of reasons for that, but that doesn't mean it has to be the one that you use. Some people that I work with still will not use Google Calendar, will not use any type of electronic calendaring system, and will only use paper. So it's important to be open-minded when inviting them to use a calendaring system. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. All right. So how do we go from only classes to that last slide that we had? It's a very systemic process, right? And Elizabeth Hamblett has this college study scheduling grid tips on how to create the schedule. And then I adapted that and have created kind of a 10 steps to a successful semester for the college students that I work with. And step 4 and 5 is to create this big picture of the semester with due dates, and then to create the weekly schedule that inputs all of the class schedules, the time to plan, the clubs and activities, and all of the other things that I talked about before that can take up all of that free time. So it's a very systematic approach to just putting it in, right? And it's developing that habit of, what am I doing today, and putting it in. And in this previous slide, that student has developed that habit and that routine, whether it's the night before or it's in the morning, or it's as it happens, right? So like if you get an appointment, you plug it in that moment. So that's the best process that we've been able to come up with. I've been able to come up with to help with that scheduling.
So moving on to FERPA. So I mentioned this earlier. This is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So in high school, as a parent, you are likely getting information from the school and from your child's teachers. If your child is struggling in a certain class, you're likely hearing from that teacher. You're getting the report cards at the end of the semester or the term. If your child is on an IEP or a 504, then you're likely involved in the annual meetings that happen every year to assess progress on goals. And you may be participating in progress meetings intermittently as well. In college, all of that academic information about how your child is doing and what grades they're earning, that goes to the student and not to the parent. And that's even if you are paying for the expensive bill, the cost of college, that information goes to your child, unless your child signs a waiver, and then you can access that kind of information. So this is really helpful to know, and to be able to talk with your child ahead of time about what level of communication you're looking for. Does it mean signing that waiver, or is it having check-ins with your child to see how they're doing week to week to know how they're doing? So that's a big shift. And this is a very detailed slide. I'm going to go through this with you, and then at the end give you the takeaway of all this information. So there are differences in laws. Starting in high school, there's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. You may have heard of IDEA. There's also the Section 504 of the Rehab Act, a specific subpart of that act. And these are in effect until your child takes that diploma or before they age out of the system, before the age of 22. And what this means is you receive a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive setting, and that you may be placed on a 504 or IEP plan, which can include accommodations like extra time on tests or tests in a separate room, modifications on assignments, or specialized instruction. And the district, the school, and the parents are very heavily involved in this process. They identify the needs and challenges. The district provides an evaluation to help inform the goals on the IEP or the 504. And again, parents are part of that annual meeting and may be involved in some progress meetings throughout the year as well. Things shift in college to the Americans with Disabilities Act and a different subpart of Section 504 of that same Rehabilitation Act. And this is in effect at all public and private post-secondary programs that accept federal funding, which is most of them. And this really means equal access to education and that you will not be discriminated against for your disability. It also means 504 plans and IEPs that were in place in high school aren't recognized in college. You can access accommodations, and we will go through that process. You can access them through the Disability Support Office on college campuses. But one big change here too is that modifications will not be something that your child will access in college. And so if in high school your child received modifications on assignments, like given a different assignment than the rest of the class, you're given a different book to read, those types of things won't be in place in college. So that's really helpful to know. And also helpful to know is that your student really needs to be an active participant in the process. They need to initiate, engage in the disability support, working with that office and providing what they need to get those accommodations in place, which includes providing documentation. So whether that is previous testing within a certain time frame, neuropsych testing, psych testing, a letter from a treater like a psychiatrist, but that doesn't come from the college. It comes from the student providing that to the college to support those accommodation requests. So the big takeaway is, yes, there is a change in the laws. IEPs and 504s are not recognized in college, but that being said, you can still receive accommodations, and we're going to talk you through that process.
And just to add a little bit to that, the student needing to initiate, it doesn't mean that someone else can't make that initial email contact or support the student in making that initial email contact, but without their participation, it will not move forward. So the Disability Services Office really has to hear from them, have conversations with them to understand from them directly what they're looking for and how their disability and diagnosis impacts them. And I don't know if it was here, Lori, or not, that someone asked, is it good to transition from an IEP to a 504?
It was around this time. Yep.
Or a little bit later. So I don't know if.
I think it's actually the next slide. So I think you can cover it now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think that, I think some colleges make that recommendation primarily because they're trying to encourage the student to become a self-advocate. But I think that it's important for the student to receive the services that they need while they're in high school, while simultaneously working on that level of self-awareness and self-advocacy to be empowered and to be ready for that next step when it really is going to be their responsibility. They can access help and they can be supported. They have to be open to that, and people can help them do that, but they have to be able to articulate and speak to disability services offices themselves. So I don't think it's a requirement to go from an IEP to a 504 because neither of those documents are going to be directly translated into, and it's not an automatic assumption, or I should say it's not automatic that either the IEP or the 504 will be recognized by the college. It's a whole different process that has to be undertaken. And so to that end, how do accommodations, how are accommodations requested? What is the process when a student is in college? So Elizabeth Hamblett, again, provides this phenomenal form that's, you probably can't read it, an accommodations request preparation form. It's in her book. And I have found that it's really helpful in preparing a student to be their own advocate for accommodations in college. And it sort of outlines the process of developing that awareness and advocacy so they can have a little cheat sheet. And, if they have anxiety or something, or it's harder for them to remember, they can have something in writing with them to help guide that process as they're requesting accommodations. So they need to know what their diagnosis, what their disability is. They need to know how that disability or diagnosis impacts their everyday life, impacts their learning, impacts their academics. And then they have to have a knowledge of kind of the neuropsych testing or any other reports that go into supporting that diagnosis and that impact, right? To help them understand what their strengths are, understand their learning profile, right? What their strengths are, what their challenges are. And it's helpful if they can speak articulately about those strengths and challenges with the disability services point person. And so it's also helpful if they have had an IEP or if they've had a 504, if they can speak about how they use the accommodations and what supports were in place for them previously that were helpful and why, right? And just another point, in fact, sometimes students may be coming from high school and going to college and not have either an IEP or a 504, but that doesn't mean that without the proper documentation that they can't get accommodations in college, if that makes sense, right? Because it's a whole different process.
Yes.
So as part of the process of advocating for themselves, it is helpful for them to have an understanding of what accommodations would be helpful and why, right? So whether they've used them before or not, it's helpful for them to have working knowledge of what could be helpful. And some disability services providers are great, and they'll say, well, have you ever used this? And the student may not have ever heard of it. Parent might not have ever heard of it if they're involved. But it's okay to say no, because then someone might say, well, it could, and it's okay to say no, but what is it used for? Why might it be helpful for me? So that you can learn from them and show an openness and a growth mindset for how something might be helpful, because they may have a tool that the high school didn't have that can be incredibly beneficial. to you. Like, I think text-to-speech software a lot of times is something that universities and colleges will offer that high schools may or may not make available to students.
And Courtney, just two quick things that we talked about in the live presentation. One, the documentation, the testing, the assessments. Typically, those need to be within a certain time frame. So it's helpful to ask the disability office, what is that time frame? What does recent testing mean? And it might mean within 3 years. It might mean sooner than that. So that's just good for you to know now. And then another piece is some students are reluctant to go and share this information and disclose this information with the disability office because they're worried about where this information goes. The information stays within the office. The only bits that leave are the professors will receive a list of the students who are getting the accommodations, but they won't know why. And so it's just helpful for students to know that that information, their diagnoses, their testing, all of that stays confidential within that office.
Right. And I think that at this time also someone shared that the testing in the neuropsych, one of the requirements is to do an adult IQ test. And I think that just reiterates the need for testing that's happened within a recent time frame.
Yeah.
And I also think that once you have kind of once you know the college that, well, actually, I think it's smart to look at, if you're looking at a certain number of colleges, it's smart to go into their disability services website, because a lot of times you can find the requirements for specific tests that need to be included in that neuropsych report. So if you are going to be having a neuropsych report done, it's important to share those testing requirements that the universities or the colleges have with the person who's going to be doing the testing, so that you can make sure that those tests are included in their report, or at least have a conversation with them about the needs that you anticipate for documentation. I think that was, I feel like there was something else that someone mentioned, but I can't remember it at the moment. And so these are the top 10 accommodations for ADHD and other learning disabilities that most colleges and universities make available to students. We mentioned reduced course load before. Priority registration just means, and this is something that some universities will offer, others won't. It just means that as students have the opportunity to register for classes before other students. And the reason for this is, a lot of students don't like early classes, will miss them if they're too early, so they can find like a time frame that works better for them. They can find a professor who may be more exam focused as opposed to paper writing focused, and the exam focused works better with your strengths. So it's variable, but that's what priority registration means. One accommodation that some universities and colleges do offer, but it can be a slippery slope, is extended time for assignments to be turned in. So you can kind of see why that would be a slippery slope, because it's kind of a snowball effect if students allow themselves to be late at turning in assignments. And when does that lateness end? Because ultimately the semester ends. So it sometimes can be a great backup, but if it becomes the norm, it can become problematic. And I think someone mentioned in the live presentation that allowing tutoring to line up, and sometimes you can't get the tutoring hours at a time that you need based on a deadline. But I think that if the student can advocate for themselves to the professor about why they might need extra time, at least the students that I've worked with, it seems like a lot of the professors are fairly reasonable, but it just takes that level of advocacy to happen. And I think that one of the differences that I was talking about before with the IEP 504 versus and switching from an IEP to a 504 in high school, I think one of the things that I mentioned in the live presentation is sometimes I think colleges will tell you that one accommodation that can be on IEPs and 504s in high school that they like to see sort of disappear is that extended time, and helping students start to understand what happens when assignments are turned in late. Um, because they just want that sense of time to be in the reality of deadlines, as opposed to being more lenient with turning things in late and getting full credit, for example, because it's not always a reality in college. So I think sometimes that may be one of the reasons that you hear people saying, oh, it's best to go from an IEP to a 504, but because there's no modifications, but also just for the deadline purpose.
So given all of these changes, the FERPA that's in place, the differences in laws, the changes in schedule, everything we discussed, what are some of the skills that your child will need? So metacognition is one big one, and that's really knowing about your disability, knowing about how you learn, understanding what your strengths are so you can lean on them, and also understanding what are your areas of challenge and what might you need to support some of those challenges. And this really ties in with advocacy and asking for help. If you have a good awareness of some of the supports and strategies that help you with some of the more challenging aspects, then you can advocate for those things, whether it's specific accommodations, academic supports, emotional supports on campus. Time management. Self-management is a big one. We've talked a lot about this, but again, there's so much time that your child needs to structure now outside of classes on their own independently. And that can range from finding time to study and finding places to study to waking up in time for classes and doing all the things they need to be doing in between. So that's a big one. And then there's impulse control, being able to resist all the many temptations that a college campus offers. There are so many that may seem more appealing than going to class or doing your work, but being able to resist some of those, prioritize what needs to be done first before you maybe indulge in some of the funner items.
And then the other skills include task initiation, follow through, motivation. We've talked a lot about this this evening as well. It goes without saying, like, you got to get up, you've got to go to class. There's no one to wake you up and help you get there. You have to follow through with the assignments. Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility to be in college, but it's a lot of opportunity as well. And then communication skills. So in addition to being able to verbally articulate or write in order to self-advocate, colleges and college professors communicate to students by email. So that's one incredibly important skill that students need to develop, is checking their email. It's how they know that it's time to register. It's how they know that tuition bills are to be paid. It's how they know that housing is open and it's time to register for housing. Not to mention all of the communications that take place from professors regarding the classes. And figuring out where the professors communicate is also important, whether it's in the learning management system like Canvas or Blackboard, or another system that the school uses, or whether it's through email. So it's important for the student to have strong communication skills when going to college. And stress management skills, right? Beginning to have a conversation about how do you maintain kind of your level-headedness. When you get overwhelmed, what do you do? And that goes back into that self-advocacy and need to ask for help. One of the most important skills I think a college student or anybody can learn is that it's okay to ask for help. If you get overwhelmed, who are you going to talk to? If you get stressed out, what are you going to do? Are you going to exercise? Are you going to make sure that you're sleeping? Do you know some breathing techniques? And a lot of times it's great because the schools are aware of college being stressful for students, and they offer a variety of activities and opportunities to learn about stress management and different stress management techniques. So, but having conversation with your student about those so that they go in armed with knowledge of what helps them. And then academic skills, right? So you go to college to learn, to get an education. So having strong academic skills is important, as is being able to access tutoring if you need to. So knowing what classes you might need to have tutoring and the time when you might need to get it and how to get that. So again, asking for help is one of the most phenomenal skills that anyone can have. And in talking with students, normalizing it, that asking for help is something that we all do, right? Whether it's calling the plumber or whether it's calling someone to um, help me out with a ride somewhere, right? Like we all need help from people. It takes a village, right? So normalizing that is important for teenagers and college students in particular to understand.
And if you want to assess with your child their level of readiness, these are two great surveys that we've listed below here, the Landmark and the Lassie. The links will be at the end of our slides on a resource page. But if you are curious what your child's strengths are and they're curious about what they could work on or what they struggle with, that these are two good, helpful surveys.
Or what they already have, right? Like what skills
Yeah.
they already have
Exactly.
in place too. So it's good. So you're ready to make that list of colleges that you want to go consider for your child. So you're all ready, set to go. But the most important first question to ask is to ask your child themselves, like, do you want to go to college? Like, is this your goal? What is your goal after high school? Because as you probably have realized by now, the requirement of the child being able to advocate for themselves, initiate tasks, follow through, and be responsible in general for their lives on a college campus requires their buy-in. And if they don't want to be there, it doesn't make sense, for my opinion, anyway, for you to pursue that. It doesn't mean that it has to be no college forever. It just might mean that it's not the right next step for them now. And so making sure that it's their goal to go to college is really a very important first step. And it can be a conversation starter also. To help them understand, to help get a sense of what is their understanding and of what college means, right? Beyond an education and what that looks like. So once you've had that conversation, once you've invited them to see if that is their goal and they have said yes, the next step is to ask a lot of the same questions that you would be asking of any child who wants to go to college, right? And a great tool for that is Naviance, which many times is provided by high schools. Students get accounts through their high school for Naviance, and you can input a variety of these variables that are listed on this slide, and it comes up with a list of schools to consider. And I think that it's okay to take a little bit of to take as a parent to have the authority to say, the distance from home, I'm setting that boundary, right? To set some boundaries with your student who has a learning disability or a different level of readiness for going to college than some other students might have. For example, I have a 22-year-old who kind of the world was her oyster, and she was able to sort of make, she had a little bit more leeway in deciding distance from home, for example, or setting, or, the campus, whether it was easy to navigate or hard to navigate, right? With my son, I wasn't willing to allow him to get on a plane and fly away because I knew he wouldn't be able to navigate an airport on his own at the age of 18. Right. So I feel like as a parent, you're allowed to have some say in these variables with your student. And again, it's great conversations to have with them as they start to develop an awareness of what their strengths, what their challenges are, and what the reality of being a college student on a certain campus would be like. So Naviance is a great tool to help kind of take the number of colleges from here down to a smaller point that matches the needs of your specific student.
So once you've narrowed down a college list, you're exploring the websites, you start visiting college campuses. These are a list of good questions you can ask once you're there visiting, more specifically about the supports available. And I won't go through each one, but it's just helpful to know what level of academic supports are available on campus, what level of counseling supports, what is the criteria to accessing some of these supports and programs, and is there an additional cost? Also very helpful to know. And then just more specifics about the accommodation process. College to college, they may offer slightly different accommodations, so helpful to ask them, what are the typical accommodations you provide at your school? Where is your disability services office located on campus? Because if your child is accessing accommodations, they will need to know where to go to access them. And then under other things like how to handle certain accommodations, like testing accommodations, it's helpful to know that once you receive certain ones, like testing in a separate, less distracting environment, the student needs to be able to follow through in steps to make sure that the disability office reserves that room. So just helpful to know what are next steps after you actually get the accommodations in place.
And additionally, it's important for the student to understand their responsibility in accessing those accommodations, because sometimes the disability services point person won't reserve the room for them unless they make a request, and there's sometimes some time requirements, so you need to make the request a week before the exam.
Exactly.
And sometimes accommodations will need to be requested every semester, so even if you request them in the fall, it doesn't mean you have them for subsequent semesters. But some universities will have it for the full academic year. So it's just important to understand what the differences are and their process and how that applies to your student's situation.
Also, as you're exploring the college search process, it's really helpful to know that there are colleges with different levels of support. So we'll start with your typical four-year schools and what they usually offer. Schools have disability offices where you can request accommodations, as we've discussed. There are varying levels of academic supports. At a minimum, there's usually tutoring and rating centers, but some schools even offer more than that, like peer advising and early alerts. So helpful to know a little bit more about what those academic supports are as you're searching. And then professors have office hours where students can drop in if they have questions. And then there are counseling offices, and these days more and more support is being offered. So there's our typical individual one-on-one counseling, but some schools offer group counseling and even psychoeducation on different topics like sleep and stress management. So then moving on to colleges with a little bit more support. There are a couple schools like this around here. Curry and Dean are two to name, but there are more that offer programs within the college that offer more comprehensive support for students with specific diagnoses like learning disabilities and executive function challenges. And this may be, they offer courses on executive function skills, specific skills that your child can learn. It may be more individualized academic coaching. So if you're looking up a school that has a specific program, it's helpful to know what are the services that are involved, what's the admission criteria, how much does it cost? And then the colleges with the most support. There are schools out there. Landmark is is the closest to us in Vermont. You may have heard of it. These are schools that are designed specifically for students with certain profiles like ADHD, executive function, and autism spectrum. And these support services are really integrated throughout all the classes, throughout all the curriculum for every student. So it's really helpful to know that there's different levels of support that colleges can offer. I think one takeaway from this slide is the colleges can offer the best of support, but if your child isn't in a place to access that support, then it doesn't matter how good the support is. So I think that's a really good question, a really good conversation to have with your child as you're exploring these different colleges and the different levels, is what are they willing to access? What are they willing to initiate and follow through on?
Mm-hmm. And I think at this point, someone mentioned that Tufts has a program that's really good for people with that who have
Yes, Tufts and Carnegie Mellon were
right,
both mentioned.
Yep. And I think that certainly the list that we have of colleges with more support is not exhaustive. There are so many colleges and universities with specific programs that do offer more support. And I mentioned that the K&W guide for colleges for students with learning disabilities can be a helpful resource. But I think it's also just important to explore the website and see what those specific services are, programs are. And I think it's also important to name that a number of these, the application process. So it's not a given necessarily that if you choose to go to this college that you will be a part of the particular program for learning disability. So it's important to understand what the application process is and what the entrance requirements are for them, because some of them have their own separate application process. In addition to the application for admission process, some are connected. So it varies. It's just important to arm yourself with information as always, right? Okay. So in addition, separate from, or in addition to the support that colleges can provide, there's also an option for private pay support, right? And I think one of the biggest differences in the college program supports and the private pay supports really has to do with who is doing the initiating. And with the college support programs, to my knowledge, it still requires the student to initiate and go to seek out that help. Whereas in private pay supports, there can be a lot more depending on the level of support, but the expectation is that the external support, the private pay support, is kind of a backup, eyes and ears, and someone who will initiate the reaching out for help to the student themselves, so that it doesn't put the onus on the student to reach out and access the help. They still have to use it, right? And incorporate that help into their life, but they don't necessarily have to initiate it. So that's a big difference. But again, there are varying levels of support for private pay, all the way from, meeting with a coach once or twice a week. Maybe it's once a week for half an hour. Maybe it's once a week for an hour, or twice a week for a half an hour each with the student initiated check-ins. Maybe it's more moderate support in which the student has daily check-ins that's coach initiated. Maybe it's 15-minute conversations. Maybe it's the coach is supporting the student in accessing and making sure that they're using the program that they're enrolled and involved in on their college campus, right? And helping to make that transition from private pay to the college only supports. Or maybe there are other, team members that are involved that the coach is supporting that student in accessing and working collaboratively to help the student. And then there's also the comprehensive support that is typically more residential in nature. And so some examples of those are Mansfield Hall or the college internship program. Effectively, what that means is that instead of the student living at home or living in a college dorm itself, they live in another place, right? That is the program that houses the program with other participants in the program while they are going to a university or they are taking college classes, but might not be degree-seeking student. So Mansfield Hall has places in Oregon, in Wisconsin, and then up in Burlington, Vermont is the closest. And then the college internship program has 5 or 6 sites, I believe, but one of them is in Western Mass. So effectively, they are taking college classes either degree seeking or non-degree seeking, but they are not living there on campus, but they're also not living at home, right? So they're having that in between residential experience with other students taking college classes, but it's a lot more structured. And so they provide social support. They will provide the academic coaching support, tutoring support, and then they provide the meals as well, or they help them learn how to cook, those types of life skills they're supporting them with as well. It's important to note that there's an application process typically for that. And it's also over and above what is being paid for college tuition at whatever the university is. So most of these residential comprehensive support programs are located in close proximity to where there are colleges and universities for them to be students. And so, right, so we, a few slides back said one of the most important questions to ask your student is college their goal? And if it's not, and it's not right now, there are other options after high school, right? So whether it's working and taking a class at a community college, it's taking a gap year, and gap years, in my mind used to mean like, oh, well, I have to sign up for a program and I have to go abroad and do something. But gap years have taken on a whole new level of meaning. And there's so many different varieties of ways to construct an intentional year of growth for a student. And as I understand it, gap years are really just that, like an intentional year to pause and to grow. And there are some great resources, there's some great resources of people whose focus is looking at what can a gap year look like for your student, and how can we construct that based on their strengths, their needs for growth, their interests, and their vision for what that year of growth would look like. And certainly there are other options that Lori is quite familiar with as well.
Yeah, so you may have heard of MRC, which is the Mass Rehab Commission, and they're a really great resource, and they can get involved now while your child is in high school. Your school can make a referral, or you yourself can make a direct referral, but you will be assigned a vocational counselor that will help to support your child in whatever their vocational and or educational goals may be. And it may be some vocational and job training, it may be some skills preparation, it may be job placement. And I believe they also provide financial assistance for students who are attending community college and state schools. So that's really helpful to know, a great resource. Definitely look into this as kind of something supplemental to whatever you're planning for post-secondary. Yeah.
And the postgraduate year, for people that may or may not be familiar with that, if you have graduated from high school, but your student's not really ready to go to college, they can have kind of an in-between year known as a postgraduate year that is offered by a variety of different independent schools, boarding schools. So there's more of a structure to the day, more oversight for the student, like high school, but more independence than high school. And it's a residential experience, right? So they still have a greater responsibility for choosing how to use that free time. And so if you're looking at that and you're looking at independent boarding schools, you just have to make sure that they offer a postgraduate year if your student has already graduated from a high school. And then transition programs, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but if a student has an IEP and they are not ready for college, you can work with, so there's a requirement within the IEP to have a transition plan in place, right? It's supposed to start at the age of 14, and the student is supposed to be highly involved in that programming and planning. And so sometimes if a student is not ready either academically to move on to college or career, there can be a transition program that is an opportunity, but the student cannot graduate from high school receiving their diploma in order to participate in these transition programs. So the transition programs can work on life skills, academic skills, and it's important to talk with your point person for your IEP to have that conversation as part of the IEP and transition plan moving on from high school to after they're 18, I believe, right, Lori?
I believe so. Yeah.
So for their 12th grade year, I guess. So before the end of their 12th grade year, it's important to make that decision about transition program or graduation, because you can't graduate and participate in a transition program. And there's always work, right? Always getting a job. And then there is military as an option. So that wraps up our presentation. These are the resources that we use to inform the information that we shared with you this evening. Here's another section of the resources that we used. The book that we mentioned, the From High School to College by Elizabeth Hamblett, is available at the ldadvisory.com if you're interested. I think it's available at other places like Amazon and such, but sometimes she offers a discount if you purchase directly from her. I think she's coming out with a new edition of it, though, as well. Final, thank you for being here. Listening to us and sharing the journey with us of presenting this information. Thank you for the input that some of you had to help us with your questions and other information that you had. And then we just, in full disclosure, we're not college planners. We are happy to support you if you have questions or are interested in consulting with us for your particular student, but we're not college planners at all. We're happy to support the transition and provide you with some information as it relates to your student if you're interested in a consultation time with us. And that's our contact information in case you'd like to be in touch with us.
Great.
I think that wraps it up.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.